Now, so far in this series, we have said that wisdom is a collection of skills and dispositions that help us to thrive in the midst of life's difficulties and uncertainties. We've also said that wise people trust God. They don't depend on their own abilities to figure out what they should think and how they should live. They submit to God, recognizing that He is more knowledgeable and more powerful than they. Now, we have to concede that trusting God is not always easy. After all, there are lots of things that happen to us that make it difficult for us to trust God. But if you'll remember, we said that really the only way to trust God is to trust God. It's just to get out there and do it in the midst of the challenges of life. Now, this week we want to turn our attention from trusting God to the fear of the Lord. And the first thing that we want to ask ourselves is this: what is the fear of the Lord? You know I love these questions, okay? So just settle in and get used to it. I like questions because I want you engaging your own mind. And I want you recognizing that you have questions too, and that it's okay. So let's just start at the beginning. What is it to trust God? Well, we can sort of lay the foundation by talking about two different kinds of fear. Okay? Now, sometimes preachers will say that, there's this kind of fear where you're like terrified of something, and then there's this kind of fear where you respect something. And then what God wants is your respect. He doesn't want you to be terrified of Him. He wants you to respect Him. And for the most part, that's basically true. But it's not entirely satisfactory. Why? Well, because if we were to ever come into direct contact with a holy God, the only appropriate reaction is to be absolutely terrified. Why? Because we are not holy. Because we are not like Him. It would scare our socks off. I remember when I was a teenager, I'm kind of ashamed to admit this, but I used to pray, okay, Lord, please don't send an angel to visit me. Because if an angel appears in my room in the middle of the night, I'm going to have a heart attack and die, and that'll be the end of it. That wasn't entirely inappropriate. So Natalia and I were kind of talking this through, trying to figure it out. And all of a sudden, we hit upon what the real difference is. There is a kind of fear that God does not want. It is the kind of fear that leads to mistrust and ultimately to loathing. It is the kind of fear that causes us to be obsessed with what this person or thing is going to do to us. Can you see why God doesn't want that kind of fear? It's the kind of fear that separates, not brings together. It's the kind of fear that a victim of abuse has for their abuser. And if you think people don't fear God in that way, I'm here to tell you I did. And I work on it every day not to do it now. There is, however, a kind of fear that God does want. What is that kind of fear? Well, it's the kind of fear we've been talking about all along. Yes, it is a respect, centrally, a respect for God's position and person. But it is respect, it is a fear, yes, sometimes maybe even a terror, that leads to trust and ultimately to love. It is the kind of fear that is maybe less interested in the punishment we're going to receive and more interested in the ways that we're going to disappoint, in this case, our God. It reminds me of this friend that I had in elementary school, and I went to school throughout my educational years, and he used to talk about when he got spanking. And he was really a good kid. He didn't get spanking very often. But, it happens sometimes. And to this day, I remember him talking about, man, the worst part of it is not the spanking. If they just spank me and get it over with, I'd be all right. No, the worst part was the 45 minutes his parents took to explain why he was getting a spanking. The truth is, I know his dad. His dad he loved his sons enough to discipline them, but he didn't like it. That man was as good a man as anybody you'll ever find. He did not take pleasure in this. And I bet that 45-minute conversation was a little bit of delay tactic. Oh, I got to do this, but I don't want to. Well, let me talk some more about it. Well, why was that a bigger deal? Well, part of it is you're 10, 11, 12. You just want to get your spanking and get over with so you can go play. But part of it was because the conversation reminded him, my parents really aren't happy about this. And the truth is, even though he was a mischievous little boy, he really did love his parents. And he didn't want to disappoint them. Because as I said, they really were good people. That's a different kind of fear. That's a different kind of respect than the other kind that we discussed. Now, we can take that foundation and expand upon it just the way that we did last week. Remember last week we talked about trust, and we talked about these practical, visible manifestations of trust. Well, we can do the same thing with the fear of the Lord. And our text gives us a couple of those right here. Notice the very first line in verse 7. He doesn't actually start with fear the Lord. What he starts with is, do not be wise in your own eyes. And just in case we've missed the point, Proverbs 22:4 comes back and it tells us explicitly what he's trying to say. Humility is the fear of the Lord. But it's interesting how he puts it here. Okay? So, when you read that, do not be wise in your own eyes, on the surface, it appears he's saying, don't overestimate your own abilities. That makes sense. That fits real well with the way we kind of understand humility. And it's certainly part of what he's saying. But when we read this from a New Testament perspective, part of what we realize is that he's not just saying don't overestimate your own abilities. Part of what he's saying is don't be so focused on yourself at all. Remember what Jesus said on at least a couple of different occasions in his ministry. He would say things like, look, if you want to follow me, you got to deny yourself, take up your cross. Come along, let's go. Or he would say, hey, look, if you want to keep your life, you got to lose it. But if you try to keep your life, you will lose it in the worst possible way. Sort of my paraphrase there. There is this very real sense in which humble people are, yes, they are keenly aware of everybody else. They're not ignorant of themselves. They just don't think about themselves all the time. And they are keenly aware, yes, of their own limitations. I know I'm not supposed to use all my bullets in one sermon, but I love this story. You'll probably hear it again. I was up for an award at Southwestern when I was in seminary. And it was an award that was not in my normal field of study. I was normally a New Testament guy, Old Testament guy, but I was up for an award in historical theology. So I got to sit at this table with James Leo Garrett. James Leo Garrett is a legendary figure in Baptist life. He passed away a couple of years ago. It seems like he was 199. I think he was only maybe 95 or something. I don't know. But he was so accomplished. And Dr. Garrett had graduate degrees from Southern Seminary and Princeton Seminary and Harvard University. I mean, he had all these different, some of the most prestigious institutions in the country. He'd written this 2-volume systematic theology. He was respected around the world, still is. And he was as gracious and humble as anybody I could ever imagine. He had more right to put on airs than most anybody I've ever been around. And yet his interest was in me. I had no right to sit at that table with him. And yet he treated me as an equal. And then one of my advisor, New Testament prophet, comes up and starts teasing me. He says, Wade, are you actually going to be crass enough to accept an award in historical theology? He had this big grin on his face, like, hey, I got you. Dr. Garrett just said, now, Bruce, you know that someone can be a specialist in more than one field. I'm going to tell you right now, I was ready to crawl up to the table because I wasn't a specialist in anything. That's humility. That is humility. Celebrating the other when you have every right to toot your own horn. Now, we get another practical manifestation of the fear of the Lord. Here in the last line of verse 7, it says, fear the Lord and shun evil. If we wanted to put this statement into words that at least people in my generation, and maybe younger generations would understand, we would rephrase it this way. Tell evil to talk to the hand. This is the language of inclusion and exclusion. And those who fear the Lord exclude evil from their lives. It's just not a part of what they do. Now, we could go all over Scripture looking for other possible manifestations of the fear of the Lord, what it looks like in the real world to fear the Lord. But I just took two out of a passage that we've already spent some time with. If you'll recall, we spent 2 weeks talking about Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Well, just a few verses later, in verse 13, it tells us, Moses tells us that to fear the Lord is to be loyal to him alone. Now, Moses was talking about idolatry, and his logic makes perfect sense. If you really fear God, the real God, the God who actually made heaven and earth, you're not going to bow down to a silver statue of a naked lady or a gold statue of a cow. You're just not going to do it. We'll talk about why in a few minutes, but you're just not going to do that. Now, we don't usually have problems bowing down to silver statues of naked ladies or worshiping cows. No, our idol is much closer to home. It's ourselves. And that's where the fear of the Lord needs to manifest itself. It's a choosing not to value myself over God. God is the one to whom I'm loyal, because he's the one who made me. I didn't make myself. He made me. And then if we go backwards in the chapter to verse 2, we find that the fear of the Lord manifests itself in obedience. So if we actually respect God, really respect him for his position and his power, we'll actually do what he says. There's a lot of, I hadn't really thought about this until just now, but there's a lot of interaction there with the notion of trust. Because we're also not just, we're not just respecting God for his power and position. We're also trusting that he has our best in mind. So that's a big part of this too. So you need to keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to it in just a second. Now, what are the benefits of fearing the Lord? What are the benefits of fearing the Lord? Why would we want to live a life where we are humble and where we're loyal to God and where we do what God says? Why would we want to, and where we shun evil? Why would we want to do that? Well, our verses right here, 7 and 8, they tell us. Because God promises personal well-being to those who fear him. Now, you need to, this language, it's not magic, it's metaphor, okay? So you're not going to go to the doctor next week and say, wow, I've really been fearing the Lord well lately. So is my cholesterol down? That's not how this works. But if we live a a life over the long haul of proper respect for God, that's going to result in a pattern of behaviors that will tend to promote spiritual, emotional, and yes, physical well-being. Now, the Proverbs also promise us that those who fear the Lord will live a long time. That's in part because, as Proverbs points out, you're not out committing shenanigans. There's this great discourse. I think it's in Proverbs 1 where the writer of the prologue to Proverbs is saying, hey, listen, don't go hanging out with people who shed innocent blood. In other words, don't spend your time with the criminal element. Why? Because it'll get you killed. This is not hard stuff. This is not deep stuff. You don't have to have a master's degree in philosophy to get it. This isn't Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics. It's just life. When you're out trying to steal people's stuff, it's weird how bad things happen to you. And then Proverbs also promises wealth and honor. Now, wealth was important to people in the ancient world. Wealth provided at least a modicum of stability, safety, dependability. Proverbs will later talk about how wealthy people depend upon their wealth for protection. That's just reality. That's what they did. Now, if the Assyrians come and invade your country and, do all the horrible things that they did, that your wealth is not going to help you much there. But under normal circumstances, wealth was a good thing. But what people in the ancient world wanted more was honor. They wanted the public acknowledgement of their worth by their community. In a nutshell, that's honor. That's what they wanted. And we are not an honor-shame society in general. But they were. And honor was really, really important. But the most important thing that is promised to those who fear the Lord is not found in Proverbs. It's in Psalm 25:12. And it is God's instruction. And really that serves as a very good segue to a question we didn't ask last week, and so we need to ask now. How is it that trusting God and fearing God is related to a life of wisdom? I think we've made a pretty good argument that you should trust God. And we've made a pretty good argument that you should cultivate the fear of the Lord in your life. But what does that have to do with wisdom? Well, and it starts right here where we just left off with the previous question. Those who fear God and trust God do so because they already know something about God. And yet, fearing and trusting God opens the way to learning more about God. Proverbs 2:5. Think about it this way. Let's say we're all out playing basketball. And given the collection of us that we've got here, we're not very good, right? Okay? We're getting the stink beat out of us by every team we play. And all of a sudden, We're out there trying to figure out, can we even score against this team? The limousine pulls up. And a tall, skinny guy gets out of it. And Roy looks at me and he says, wait, that's Steph Curry. And I said, oh, well, yeah, okay, I know who Steph Curry is. And then he walks over and he says, hey, I'm here to play on your team. Now, if I tell him, no, man, we got this, and don't worry about it, we're good, we're okay. That means that I don't have any sort of proper respect for his basketball skills, especially as compared to mine or yours. What if I say, that'd be great, come on, man, let's play. But I never pass him the ball, I don't trust him. I don't trust that he will do what he claims to be capable of doing. Either way, it means I don't really know Steph Curry. No. The only proper reaction is for me to say, absolutely, here's the ball, and then go and do all the dirty work. Set the screens, do the rebounding, help on defense. That's what demonstrates that I respect, trust, and know who Steph Curry is. Or better yet, just go sit down. That's how it is with God. The more that we know Him, the more that we respect and trust Him. And the more that we respect and trust Him, the more that we know Him. Now, the second way that fearing and trusting God connects with a life of wisdom is this. People who fear and trust the Lord also know themselves better. So let's pick up our basketball analogy, okay? It would take about 3 seconds of watching Steph Curry play basketball to put my own basketball abilities into some context, right? Well, I certainly can't do that, whatever it was he just did. As he, I can dribble behind my back, I can dribble between my legs, but I can't throw a wraparound pass behind my back 15 feet, hit somebody for a dunk. I can't shoot from 35 feet and, hit 40-50% of my shots. So there is a, if you will, a humiliating element to that encounter, right? But it would also be profoundly elevating. Wow, this guy came and played basketball with me. That's the coolest thing in the world. So yes, it's humiliating, but it's also elevating. And that's how it is with God. Yes, Christ came and lived a perfect life. Puts us all to shame, right? But why did he come and live a perfect life? And just the very fact that he came and lived among us. Not as one of our elites, but as just one of us. died with us. He died just like us. And he died for us. Third, people who trust God, people who fear God, they're able to look beyond just themselves. They're able to take the focus off of themselves. We talked extensively about that. That's humility. But in that humility comes learning, right? Because you become interested in other people. You become interested in the created order. You become interested in God. Because your world is not about you. And when your world is not about you, your world opens up. And then fourthly, and by the way, you may come up with more things, but these are just the four that I came up with. When we live as people who trust God, who fear God, it clears away a lot of the emotional baggage that keeps us from seeing people and circumstances and issues as they really are. If you'll recall, when we were talking about wisdom a couple of weeks ago, we said that insight is a big part of that. The ability to see beyond the surface, to see things as they really are. But sometimes we have quite the opposite of insight. Imagine that you took off your glasses, and then you put some kind of maybe coating over it, maybe a spray paint over white spray paint. Or maybe you just put something over them that made them fuzzy. And then you put them back on and try to see. It's not going to work very well, is it? But oftentimes, that is precisely the way people are walking around in the world. They are walking around with impaired vision. Not the kind of impaired vision that I have, but impaired vision of the mind, impaired vision of the heart. Their vision is impaired by their feelings, their desires, their undealt with experiences, their memories. So much so that they don't even know who they are, much less who you are. Trusting and fearing God helps us not be like that. It helps us be the opposite of that. It's amazing when you start to deal with your own baggage, you see everything else differently too. Now, again, we need to, just like when we were talking about, the whole personal well-being thing, we need to make it clear that this doesn't happen overnight. And there's some other elements to the stew that need to come in. When people have difficult, challenging, traumatic things in their past, it's not enough simply to say, well, you need to trust God. We have to walk with them through that process as they try to build trust for God. And part of that process of building trust for God is having the courage to dig deep into their own soul. And regardless of what they find there, bring it to Jesus. And bring it to the attention of someone who can help them cope. Someone who can help them be. You know, your therapist, your pastor, your best friend, they can't help you if you don't tell them what's really going on. And you can't tell them what's really going on if you don't know what's really going on. Either because you're not paying attention, or because it's too painful to acknowledge, or because you're deceiving yourself about its true character and origins. So I have one final question for you. And it's this. Do you fear the Lord? And do you fear Him properly? Does your fear of God lead you to trust Him, to love Him? Or does it lead you to mistrust Him and to loathe Him? Or maybe you don't fear Him at all. My prayer for you today is that you will fear the Lord. And that you will do so in a wholesome, productive, and God-honoring way. Let's pray.